We all love watching period dramas set in ancient Rome, don't we? There's just something about those togas and sandals that never gets old. But if you think life in those times was peachy keen, well, think again, because what went on in ancient Rome's markets was straight up nightmare fuel. In today's episode, we not take you to ancient Rome and explore their markets and what really went on there. Do you want to find out more? Well, let's get started. The first thing you should know about Roman markets is that they were busy. We're talking non-stop hustle and bustle. This was because the markets were not only places where people could buy and sell their wares, but they were also social hubs, political arenas, and even sites of entertainment. The Romans loved a good spectacle, and they got those in their markets too. You would see gladiators fighting to the death, wild animals being sold and slaughtered for food, and even people being put to death by the Roman authorities. Yeah, it was that bad. One of the most famous markets in ancient Rome was the Fora Magnum, or the Great Market. It was the center of Roman public life, and was surrounded by government buildings, temples, and shops. Here you could buy pretty much anything you wanted, from fresh produce, to handmade goods, to slaves. Yes, slavery was still a thing in ancient Rome, despite the fact that it was officially abolished in 399 BC. But don't worry, it was totally okay because the Romans believed that it was part of their culture and tradition. They also thought that it was a necessary evil because they could undo all the hard work themselves. So they needed someone to do it for them, and who better than slaves? Speaking of slaves, one of the most horrifying things that went on in the Roman markets was the sale of slaves. Slaves were bought and sold like cattle, and were often treated worse than animals. They were forced to work long hours for little or no pay, and were beaten or tortured if they didn't meet their quotas. The Roman markets were filled with men, women, and children from all over the empire who had been captured in war or simply born into slavery. The slave trade was a huge business in ancient Rome, and the profits from it helped to fund the Roman way of life. But it wasn't just the buying and selling of slaves that went on in the markets. Sometimes the slaves were put on display in the hopes that someone would buy them. The Romans liked to show off their wealth and power, and what better way to do that than by owning a bunch of slaves? The sight of rows upon rows of slaves being paraded around the market was a common occurrence, and it was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of Roman society. Even though slavery was technically illegal, the Romans found ways around this. For example, they would often buy prisoners of war and then free them. However, these freed prisoners were still expected to serve the Roman state and were often given menial jobs with very little pay. In essence, they were still considered property and were not seen as equals to the Roman citizens. While it may seem appalling to us today, slavery was simply a fact of life in ancient Rome. It was not uncommon for wealthy Romans to own several slaves who would serve them in their homes, tend to their gardens, or work in their shops. Slaves were also used for more menial tasks, such as cleaning or cooking, and were often the backbone of the Roman economy. Now let's talk about food. The markets in ancient Rome were also full of food stalls selling everything from fresh fruit and vegetables to exotic meats and seafood. The Romans loved to eat well, and they weren't afraid to flaunt it. The sight of merchants hawking their wares, and the smell of spices and incense filled the air as shoppers made their way through the crowded stalls. It was a feast for the senses, that's for sure. However, not all food sold in the Roman markets was created equal. The cheaper cuts of meat were often tainted with sawdust or plaster to make them look bigger and more valuable than they actually were. And the fish was frequently sold as fresh when it was really old and had been preserved in vinegar. The Romans were also fond of a good blood sport, and the markets were often the site of animal slaughtering. The sight of animals being skinned alive or torn apart by dogs was not for the faint of heart. But it was a common occurrence in the Roman markets. If that wasn't enough to put you off your food, the Romans also had a strange habit of serving their meat dishes with a side of human flesh. Don't worry, it wasn't as common as you might think, but it did happen. The Romans believed that eating the flesh of criminals or slaves could give them special powers, so they weren't above using people as a culinary ingredient. Moving on, the markets in ancient Rome were also full of all kinds of goods, from clothing and jewelry to furniture and weapons. The Romans were a proud and showy people, and they liked to deck themselves out in the finest clothes and accessories. The markets were the perfect place to show off your wealth and status. However, not all goods sold in the Roman markets were genuine. Counterfeit goods were a common problem, and the authorities were constantly trying to crack down on them. The quality of the goods also varied widely, and it was not uncommon for shoppers to be ripped off. It was important to be careful when buying goods in the Roman markets. Aside from the food and goods, the markets in ancient Rome were also a hub of activity for prostitutes and pimps. Prostitution was a common practice in ancient Rome, and the markets were often the place where prostitutes could be found. These prostitutes were usually poor women who had turned to selling their bodies for money. They were often exploited and abused by the pimps who controlled them. Gambling was also a popular pastime in the Roman markets, and the stakes could be high. People would gamble on everything from chariot races to gladiatorial combat, and the losers often paid the ultimate price. The Romans were a superstitious people, and they believed that certain foods could bring good luck. As a result, there was a thriving market for food that was used for gambling. such as dice made of bone or wood. The marketplaces in ancient Rome were also a great place for merchants to network and make connections. Merchants from all over the empire came to the Roman markets to sell their goods, and they would often stay for weeks or even months at a time. During their stay, they would make connections with other merchants and potential customers. These connections were important for their businesses, and they would often last for years. It wasn't just the merchants who benefited from the marketplace. The merchants also played an important role in the Roman economy. They brought goods into the city that would not have been available otherwise, and they provided jobs for many people. The merchants were also responsible for paying taxes to the Roman government, and they were an important source of revenue. The markets in ancient Rome were a complex and fascinating part of Roman life. While they were a hub of activity and commerce, they were also a place of poverty, exploitation, and violence. From the sale of slaves to the slaughter of animals, the markets were a microcosm of Roman society, both its best and worst aspects. In conclusion, the markets in ancient Rome were a bustling and vibrant part of city life, but they were also a place of darkness and despair. From the sale of slaves to the presence of prostitutes and the slaughter of animals, the markets were a microcosm of Roman society. Nevertheless, they were an integral part of Roman life and played a vital role in the city's economy and culture. Well, folks, that's all we have for you today. We hope you enjoyed learning about the markets in ancient Rome. If you did, don't forget to leave us a thumbs up and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, remember to stay curious,